I saw them chain a female Doberman to kill her, while her pup watched. What happened next
Can we please untie
shook
her?
me.
She seems so frightened.
I've seen some
I
terrible
understand
things
your
in my
concern,
life
but we
here in
can't do that
Ironwood
right now.
Springs, this small town tucked between cold mountains and endless rain, and I thought I had grown numb to the kind of cruelty people are capable of, but nothing prepared me for what I saw when the metal door of the euthanasia room swung open that morning. I need you to stay with me until the end of this story, because what I'm about to tell you will show you why I'm still standing here, why I fight, and why you need to share this so no animal ever has to endure something like this again. Nothing shields you from a moment like that. I remember it clearly, the cold fluorescence stabbing down onto the steel table, and Raven, a skeletal Doberman mother, strapped so tightly her skin had turned raw beneath the old leather restraints. She gasped with her mouth open wide, dragging for air as if invisible hands were crushing her lungs. Her coat, drenched in something I couldn't tell, was water or pure terror, and beside her, crammed into a cage too small for even a cat, her pup Cinder screamed a sound so thin and sharp it felt like a needle punching straight into the heart. Nothing about that cry was normal. I didn't know who had done this to them, but I knew one thing for certain. Whoever it was didn't have a heart. A shelter worker stood holding a syringe, the lethal solution trembling at the tip, and his hand shook, not out of remorse, but from the kind of routine numbness that turns death into procedure. And worse than that, Grant. Haller, the man responsible for all of this, leaned against the wall with his arms crossed like he was watching some cheap joke unfold. Everyone in Ironwood Springs knew him. Men like him treat laws as obstacles, not boundaries. Cinder cried again, the sound breaking in the middle like it was running out of breath. And something inside me snapped clean in half. I don't remember stepping into the room, only the slam of my boots on the floor. The door cracking against the wall and my voice louder than anything I'd ever heard come out of me, tearing through the air. Don't touch her. The whole room froze. The syringe stopped. Grant lifted an eyebrow as if he couldn't believe I dared to challenge him. I stepped up to the steel table, the cold biting into my palms, and Raven lifted her head with the last strength she had. Her eyes, God, her eyes looked at me as if asking, is this really the end or not? You can't forget a gaze like that. People say Dobermans are aggressive, but there was nothing aggressive in Raven's eyes. It was despair. It was the look of a mother who knew she was about to die in front of the child she couldn't protect. I turned to the shelter worker, my voice low but sharp as steel. Put the syringe down. He stammered. You don't have the authority, I cut him off. I do, and I have a medical hold. They're not dying today. I placed the document on the metal tray, the sound ringing out like a starting gun, and Cinder cried again, as Raven jerked against the straps, the leather cutting deeper, until I saw blood rise beneath her skin. Nothing about this was survivable without someone stepping in. And in that moment, I made myself a promise. No one separates them again. Not ever. If you're still here listening to the beginning of this story, I want you to do something for me, for Raven, and for Cinder. Leave a comment below. Hit subscribe so you don't miss what happens next. And if you can share this video, not for me, but for the countless animals out there who don't have anyone to stand up for them. Raven and Cinder's story is long and painful and full of fear you haven't seen yet. And if you walk with us, I promise you'll understand how a single moment can change an entire life. Or two. If you've ever lived in a small mountain town, you know the strange way everything moves slower and somehow heavier, as if the air itself carries stories that never really fade. And Ironwood Springs, my town, has always been the kind of place where rain on corrugated metal can wake you at 3 in the morning, and a logging truck rolling down Main Street can make a wooden house tremble like it's sighing in its sleep. I was born here, raised here, and even now at 48, I've never been gone longer than 2 weeks. Some places hold you, whether you want them to or not. People say Ironwood Springs is beautiful in a rugged sort of way, but I think it's simply honest, with no polish and no pretense, the kind of place where folks speak little but mean everything. And maybe it's that honesty that makes cruelty like what I saw in the euthanasia room that morning so much harder to swallow. Pain hits different when it happens in a town you've always believed still had a little kindness left in it. It cuts deeper. My name is Eli Mercer, and most folks around here know me as the mechanic who runs that old garage off Highway 12, the one where the smell of motor oil sticks to my clothes so stubbornly that some nights I swear I can still smell it on my pillow. I once had a family of my own, but life doesn't always keep the things you love, and my wife Laura slipped away 5 winters ago on a night too cold and too fast for either of us to outrun. The silence she left behind never really stopped echoing. Maybe that's why seeing Raven and Cinder hit me the way it did, sharp and immediate, like someone had reached into my chest and twisted something I thought had died years ago, because fear and loss have a scent of their own, and those who've lived with them recognize it instantly. I recognized it. Ironwood Springs may look small, but there are plenty of corners where darkness can hide, and men like Grant Holler thrive in those corners. Men people call fearless, though. Really, they're just convinced that laws exist to be dodged, not followed. I've fixed his truck more than once, heard his cigarette-stained voice dripping with contempt, and when I learned those 2 dogs came from his land, I wasn't surprised, just angry and tired. But the thing that pushed me to stand between Raven Cinder and a lethal syringe wasn't anger. It was silence, the same silence that swallowed my life after Laura died. The kind that convinces you you're only existing instead of living, and something about the way Raven tried to turn her head toward Cinder despite the restraints, or the way Cinder pressed her face to the bars begging for someone to listen, cracked that silence straight down the middle. Some moments don't wait for you to choose them, and that moment chose me. Ironwood Springs isn't the kind of place where heroes show up, but it is the kind of place where you decide which way you stand, turn away in silence, or stay, even when everything behind you might collapse. I'm not a brave man. I'm just someone who can't bear to watch a living soul, human or animal, die alone. Not again. There are things you do out of logic, but that morning when I stepped into the euthanasia room, logic had nothing to do with it. It was old grief moving my feet, the kind that settles deep and waits years for a reason to rise. And that reason was a mother and her pup. So if you're watching this video, following this story from a far corner of the world, I want you to stay with me. You'll understand why I didn't walk away when I easily could have, and you'll see what I saw, a bond nothing could sever, a maternal strength powerful enough to challenge both cruelty and consequence. Some truths demand witnesses. If you still believe in anything good, even something small, hit subscribe, share this story, and leave a comment below. Not for me, but so stories like Raven and Cinder can find their way to the hearts that need to see them. Sometimes awareness is the very thing that saves a life. I remember the moment Raven's eyes met Cinder's right after I shouted in that euthanasia room, and if you've ever watched a living creature fight for its last breath while still struggling to look toward its child, you'll understand why my feet refused to move from that spot. Because everything in that bright, sterile room, the smell of antiseptic, the clatter of metal, the ragged scrape of Raven's breathing felt stretched so tight it could snap at any second. Some moments strangle the air around you. When I placed the medical hold on the tray, my hand truly shook, not from fear, but from knowing I had just kicked open a door that led into a fight longer than anything I had ever stepped into. And yet, once you're standing in front of a life, 2 lives, there isn't really a choice anymore. Not one you can live with. The shelter worker, a young man named Rick, froze for a second before glancing at his supervisor, Dale, who stood with his arms crossed, his eyes sharp with a mix of challenge and an eagerness to dodge responsibility. "You can't take both with one hold," he said. I looked him straight in the eye. "I'm not taking one, I'm taking both." The words rose without thought. I didn't know why I said it, but I knew it wasn't wrong. Raven jerked her head again, her body striking the leather straps so hard I could see the deep red grooves they carved across her neck, and I clenched my jaw because no one deserved to die like that, least of all in front of their own child. Cruelty has a way of staining the air. Dale stepped forward. No paperwork proving relation. No microchip, no registered owner. They belong to the shelter. "Not today," I growled. Rick's eyes flicked toward Grant Holler, standing in the back, leaning against the wall with that smug, empty smile, and seeing him made my blood burn because he didn't need to speak. His crossed arms and careless shrug said everything about how he viewed these two lives like garbage he'd discarded. I refused to give him another second of attention. "Release her," I said. Rick glanced at Dale. Dale muttered a curse and waved a hand. "Fine, but you're responsible for everything." "Perfect," I replied. When the restraints came off, Raven didn't stand right away. She slipped from the table and collapsed to the cold floor, her legs trembling so violently they nearly folded beneath her. I knelt beside her and reached my hand out slowly, and Raven sniffed at once, quick, desperate, before launching herself towards the cage where Cinder was curled into a shivering knot. I had never seen anything so painful and so beautiful at the same time. Cinder let out a tiny, broken cry when Raven pressed her nose through the bars and the two trembling bodies leaned into each other like survivors clawing their way back from the bottom of a storm-torn sea. It silenced the whole room. I opened the cage and Cinder shot out like a small black shadow, slamming into Raven's chest and burrowing between her legs, and Raven dropped her head, licking her pup again and again, not to clean, but as if confirming her child was truly alive. I felt something shift inside me. No one spoke. No one breathed loudly. And in that silence I heard something you only hear once in a lifetime, the sound of a life saved in the exact second it was about to end. It stays with you. "I'm taking them out of here," I said, "right now." Dale dropped his arms and sighed. "Fine, but you'll answer to the county." "I will, and Grant won't let this go." I glanced at him. He's done enough. I lifted Cinder, and Raven pressed herself against my leg like a shadow. Her breath weak but steady, and the three of us walked down the long shelter hallway with neon lights flickering off the tiles like cold reminders of a battle that hadn't even started yet. The air felt heavy. When I pushed open the door, the Montana wind slapped my face, and the rain came sideways, but strangely, for the first time in years, I didn't feel cold. Something warm had woken up. Because the moment I opened my truck door for Raven and Cinder, I knew I had stepped onto a road none of us would ever turn back from. And neither should you. So stay with me, because what comes next is where the real fight begins. Rain hammered down on Ironwood Springs like a warning the moment I opened the truck door for Raven and Cinder. And Raven climbed in first, despite her body trembling like a wire pulled too tight, while Cinder followed so closely behind her, she looked like a tiny shadow clinging to safety. When I shut the door, the rain pounding against the roof echoed through my chest, as if reminding me that I had just yanked 2 lives from the edge of a cliff, but that the cliff hadn't ended there at all. Some dangers stretch far past the moment you escape them. I started the engine, the headlights slicing through the dense curtain of rain, and Raven huddled against the back seat while Cinder pressed into her chest. Both of them watching me in the rearview mirror with eyes that seemed to ask, "Where do we go now?" I didn't have a full answer, but I knew we weren't going back to Grant Holler, and we weren't going back to that steel table. The road home twisted through pines and a slick rock incline, the night dark and damp as a cave. Yet something inside the cab seemed to glow every time Cinder looked up at Raven, and Raven turned to make sure her pup was still breathing. That's when I realized I wasn't just driving two dogs. I was carrying a promise. When I reached my house, the fireplace had been out since morning, but the old wooden walls still held a trace of warmth from the earth beneath them. And as I opened the truck door, Raven jumped down cautiously while Cinder skidded across the wet gravel like she wasn't sure the world outside the shelter was real. Everything felt fragile. Inside, I grabbed two large towels and Raven stood still while I dried her, watching every motion I made as if trying to decide whether I would hurt her, while Cinder dashed between my legs under the table back around Raven again, uncertain, frantic, hopeful. "It's all right, kid," I murmured, wiping her tiny head. When the fireplace sparked to life with its first gold flame, Raven lay down on the rug by the stove and Cinder immediately curled into her belly, their bodies forming a tight, instinctive knot of survival and devotion I'd never seen so fiercely present in any creature. But then, less than 10 minutes later, my phone rang. The caller ID read, "Shelter County Office." I answered. Mr. Mercer Dale Rourke's voice came through, flat as a printed report we received notice that you removed both dogs from the facility on a single hold. That's a violation. "I saved their lives," I replied. "We're not discussing that. The county will be reviewing separation in the morning." I looked at Raven. She lifted her head the instant my tone changed. "Separation," I repeated. "Yes. There is no proof that they're a bonded pair," Dale said before hanging up. The house went dead quiet. Separate them. After everything I had just seen. After Cinder's screams in that cage, and Raven nearly choking herself trying to reach her pup. After the way they held on to each other like the world would collapse if they didn't touch. The idea chilled me deeper than Grant's cruelty ever had. I sat down heavily, my spine sinking into the chair like it carried a boulder, because paperwork wasn't my battlefield. I fixed bolts, rebuilt engines, lived in silence, but this wasn't machinery. This was life. And I realized I had to step into a world I'd avoided my entire life, the world of rules forms and signatures sharp enough to cut. I called Marcia Collins. She picked up after a few rings. "Eli, what's going on?" "They want to separate Raven and Cinder." I figured that was coming. I need to know what I'm supposed to do. Marcia exhaled a long, tired sound. "You need evidence that they can't be separated. Video witness statements, intake notes. Anything that proves separation will cause severe stress." "I'll get it. And Eli, yeah." "Grant. Holler called my office before you did. He wants both dogs back. I'm warning you so you're prepared." I looked toward the window where the porch light reflected Raven curling protectively around Cinder, the two of them forming a small, trembling circle, as if the night outside was too wide, too cold, too dangerous. Some images carve themselves into you. I clenched the phone tighter. "Marcia." I said, "I'm not letting anyone separate them, not the county, not Grant, not anybody." The fight had already begun, not with gunshots, but with paperwork rules and the indirect cruelty of cold stamps and colder systems. But Raven and Cinder's hearts couldn't withstand another loss. And I, Eli Mercer, a mechanic who once thought he was ordinary, had just become their only shield. There are mornings when you wake and realize the world is no longer the same as it was the day before, even if the window still opens onto the same pine ridges, the same muddy patches, the same veil of mist hanging over Ironwood Springs. And the morning after I brought Raven and Cinder home, I felt that shift in the air. It wasn't the weather. It was the presence of two fragile but determined breaths inside my wooden house fighting to believe in humans again. Raven was still trembling, but she no longer shielded Cinder behind her legs the way she had the night before, and when I opened the food container she watched me longer this time, her gaze losing some of its sharp defensive edge and softening into a cautious question, as if asking whether I truly meant safety. Cinder devoured the warm food so fast I had to pull the bowl back gently, afraid she'd choke from sheer desperation. and Raven leaned down to lick her ear as though reminding her that things were different now, even if Raven herself seemed only half convinced. Peace rarely lasts long. Around 9, my phone rang again. Unknown number. I answered and heard Marcia Collins. Eli. I looked at the intake reports. There are a few things you need to know, she said, her voice clipped and professional yet dipped with something heavy beneath the surface. I'm listening. Grant Haller filed to reclaim ownership. I clenched my teeth. He neglected them. Look at Raven and Cinder, and you'll see that. I believe you, Marcia said. But the county needs evidence, and we only have 30 days. If we can't prove they're bonded, the county will separate them. Separate. From that point on, every time I saw Raven and Cinder pressed against each other, that word sliced across my mind like a blade. Marcia continued. You'll need medical notes, behavior records, witness statements, anything, proving that separation would cause severe harm to both. I'll get it, and there's someone who can help you. Who Agnes Porter. She handled an animal seizure case 3 years ago on Grant's property. Grant's name alone made the air in my house feel colder. I drove Raven and Cinder to Dr. Finley Rhodes' clinic, the sky still gray and the roads damp from the storm, and Raven lay pressed against my leg while Cinder buried her face into Raven's belly, as though the entire world existed only in those few inches of safety. Some bonds are carved from fear and fire. When we entered, Dr. Rhodes looked at me, then at the two of them, and his expression softened. They've been through a lot, he said. You've only seen the surface, I replied. He examined Raven, first her ribs, too prominent, her frame too thin, but her heartbeat steadier than before. And when he gently touched her leg, Cinder released a tiny growl and wedged herself between us, as if the universe had only 2 tasks: protect her mother and beg her mother to protect her. Rhodes nodded. I'll document it clearly strong. Bonding severe separation stress. Those words weren't just medical. To me, they were the first small flicker of hope. When I arrived back home, an old pickup was parked by the gate, and Agnes Porter stood beside it holding a folder so worn the pages had yellowed. She was in her 70s, hair, silver eyes, sharp like someone who had seen too much cruelty and still refused to bow to it. You Mercer? She asked. I am. She handed me the folder. This is my report from 3 years ago. Raven was kept in a wire pen. No clean water, no food. The wind was so cold it screamed against the tin walls. My hands tightened around the file. Grant claimed they were his. But he never cared for them, not once. She lost a pup in that litter. Agnes held my gaze. If you're telling me Raven is protecting Cinder like she's her second chance at life, I believe you. That night, I sat by the fireplace. The flames flickering across Raven's face while Cinder slept curled in her chest, the tiny rise and fall of her breathing matching her mother's. I placed my hand gently on Raven's head and she didn't pull away. She looked up at me, not with fear or caution, but with a single silent question. Will you protect us? I answered softly. Yes. I won't let anyone break this family. And in that moment I understood something. This wasn't just Raven and Cinder's fight anymore. This was ours 3 against a past. A system and a world that too often decides a life like theirs doesn't matter. Sometimes I think life has strange ways of testing you. It doesn't throw you into the storm right away, but lets you breathe for a few days, lets you believe hope has finally started taking shape, and then at the exact moment you begin to relax, it rips the floor out from under you again. 3 days after Agnes handed me that old folder, a thick envelope slid through my door with no sender's name, and when I opened it, I found a single sloppy message scrawled across the page, 1 or none. I looked out toward the road and saw only the fading silhouette of a pickup dissolving into the morning fog, and I didn't need a license plate to know whose it was because Ironwood Springs is small enough that even malice has a familiar scent. Some threats don't need signatures. I barely slept that night. Raven lay beside my bed, and Cinder curled halfway into her chest. And every time the wind slammed the window, Raven lifted her head to guard her pup on instinct while I placed my hand on her and whispered, "I'm here." We're here, though my own heart stayed coiled tight with worry. Fear can be loud even in silence. The next morning, I called Marcia Collins immediately. "I just got a threat," I said. "I figured Grant would play dirty," she replied. "Eli, this only proves you have to win the hearing." "How long do we have? 7 days?" 7 days to prove something I witnessed every hour inside my home, but the system demanded on paper videos, signatures, reports, and testimonies sworn under law. 7 days to defend a truth that was already breathing at my feet. Marcia continued, "You need to record a separation test. The county wants real behavioral evidence." I paused. I'm afraid of hurting them, I know, but it may save them. So I did what my heart hated most. I waited until Raven and Cinder were asleep, then carefully lifted Cinder into the kitchen and closed the door. It took only 3 seconds for the world to explode. Raven shot upright, slamming into the door, as if she could rip the hinges off, and she whimpered, then cried, then let out a choked howl so broken it sounded like she was losing her pup right in front of her eyes. While on the other side, Cinder scratched frantically, breathing fast, close to collapsing in panic. I kept them apart for 90 seconds. 90 seconds that felt like a sin. When I opened the door, Cinder launched herself into Raven's chest as if terrified her mother might vanish into the air, and Raven covered her pup's face with frantic licks, her entire body shaking like a tree struck by lightning. I turned away so they wouldn't see the pain tearing through me. But I knew that video would save them. And sometimes saving a life means taking the pain someone else shouldn't have to carry. Marcia watched the footage and said, "Perfect. This is gold." The hearing day came sooner than I wanted. That morning, Ironwood Springs was cold enough that my breath turned white as soon as I stepped outside, and I loaded Raven and Cinder into the truck with Cinder climbing over Raven as always, while Raven pressed her head to her pup as if to calm her. "We're going to fight," I whispered. The county building looked like an abandoned school, faded, brick-scratched glass pine needles piled on the steps, and yet inside that old structure the fate of a family would be decided a family only. I seemed to recognize as such. Some battles begin in the quietest rooms. The hearing room was cold, and overly bright neon lights bleaching the metal tables, the half-finished coffee on the clerk's desk, and the faces of the people who would decide everything. Grant Haller was already there, wearing a camo jacket reeking of cheap cigarettes, eyes sharp with bitterness whenever he looked at me, but he never glanced at Raven or Cinder, not once. To him, they were property thrown away, and retrieved only to satisfy something twisted inside him. Marcia was impossibly calm. She set down her files, adjusted her glasses, and murmured, "Don't talk too much. Truth speaks for itself." The hearing began. Dale Rourke spoke first. Both dogs were intaked together. Poor condition. No evidence of proper care. Then Dr. Rhodes. I observed a strong bond. Separation will cause severe behavioral distress. One or both may deteriorate. Then Agnes rose. Her voice trembled with age, but every word cut clean. I once saw Raven cover her pup with her body against the cold. I saw her shiver, but never gave up. A mother like that should never be separated from her child. Grant stood ranting about property, my land, and my rights, but every sentence he spat only widened the cracks in his own argument. His ignorance laid bare against the truth filling the room. And then the video played. The room froze. Raven's howl filled the speakers raw and thinned by terror, and Cinder collapsing against the door sounded like a heart cracking open. I didn't watch the footage. I watched Raven curled at my feet, her eyes looking up at me as if saying, "You understand now. Hold on to us." The hearing ended without a verdict. They needed time. But when I walked Raven and Cinder out into the cold morning, I knew that today we had placed their true soul, their bond on the table for the system to finally see. And from that truth, hope began. The morning the county called Ironwood Springs lay under a fog so dense I could barely see the pines a few steps from the house, and I stood by the stove with a hot cup of coffee in my hands, while Raven rested at my feet with her head draped across Cinder's back, their breaths rising and falling in the same rhythm as if some invisible thread had tied their souls together. Even before the phone rang, I felt the moment shifting. Some decisions shake the air before they arrive. When the vibration cut through the silence, I knew the verdict had come. Marcia spoke briefly. "Eli, they want you in person. The decision is ready." I shut off the stove, grabbed my jacket, and called Raven, and she stood the instant she heard my voice shaking her slightly scarred ear, the same ear she scraped bloody trying to break free in that euthanasia room while Cinder scurried behind her with tiny steps tapping the wood floor like soft rain. I looked at them, two souls, who had once stood in the doorway of death, and now they walked beside me like a family that had always existed. Some bonds write themselves quietly. We loaded into the truck and drove toward the county building through the thick pines, the morning wind brushing the windows like the long sigh of a tired town. And I didn't turn on the radio because I didn't need anything but the soft weight of Raven's head on the seat and the warmth of Cinder curled against her chest. Silence felt alive in the cab. When we arrived, Grant was already at the gate, his eyes carrying that same twisted conviction that the world owed him something, but for the first time I didn't feel fear or anger or resentment, just a kind of distant irrelevance because whatever power he once had over Raven and Cinder no longer mattered. He couldn't touch what had already outgrown him. Inside, Hearing Officer Daniels held a single sheet of paper. No thick dossier, no tower of files, just one page. Marcia placed a hand on my shoulder before he read, and the gesture warmed the room more than the lights ever could. Based on behavioral evidence, medical reports, witness testimony, and current care conditions, Daniels began. These two animals are determined to be a bonded pair. Separation would cause significant harm. I held my breath. And therefore, he continued, official guardianship is awarded to Eli Mercer. Permanently. Before I could react, Raven rose and placed her paw on my knee, as if she heard and understood every word, and Cinder let out a tiny sound before burying her face into Raven's chest. Grant slammed his hand against the table, shouting something no one cared to hear, and the guards escorted him out, his boots striking the floor like the last cracking pieces of a past that no longer had a place here. The door shut behind him, and the air felt weightless. That afternoon, as we drove back into Ironwood Springs, the sun broke through the sky for the first time in weeks, light spilling across the pines and sliding into my yard as if painting us a new beginning. When I opened the gate, Raven ran ahead, but didn't go far. She turned back, waiting, asking silently, "Coming with me?" Cinder stumbled forward, clumsy and bright, and Raven lowered herself to match her pace. They ran. Then, not fast, not frantic, just free, truly free. That night they slept beside me on the long couch, Raven resting her head on my shoulder, while Cinder curled on her mother's chest and I stroked Raven's back, feeling the steady, peaceful breath she had never been allowed before. No whimpers, no tremors, no haunted questions in her eyes, only trust, simple, wordless trust. And in that moment, I understood something deeper than anything I had learned in a lifetime of fixing engines and living alone. Love between humans and animals doesn't need language. It only needs presence. It only needs you to stay when they are the most afraid. Raven gently licked my hand. Cinder burrowed deeper into her mother. And my small, quiet house felt fuller than it ever had. If you've stayed with me through the end of this story, thank you. The lives of animals like Raven and Cinder are only protected because people like you care enough to listen to pause and not to turn away from the suffering of those who cannot speak for themselves. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Subscribe so you don't miss the next rescue journey. And if you can share this story, not for me, but because out there countless ravens and cinders are waiting to be seen, waiting to be saved, waiting to be loved. Love doesn't need words, but it can save an entire life.